Hello, my name is Martin Ebert. I'm an associate professor at the University of Aarhus, just outside Oslo, Norway. After being working for 20 years as a practicing architect, I started to work in academia 2 years ago, in 2018. And that was a time when I finally could work on a subject that I have been interested for about 15 years. That subject is the history and the shape and form of the cities of the area I come from. I'm coming from an area northeastern Germany, Mecklenburg. And in Mecklenburg, there are about 40 cities that we can date back to being planted in the 13th century. I have some of these cities here behind me, and of course it's very fascinating to see the shapes and the different forms of the city. But what I was starting to get interested in is, why are these cities look the way they do? Why have some of them have very stark similarities? Some of them are totally different. And to understand this planting process and how these planting processes shape the cities, I thought that was very fascinating to work on. So the methods of urban morphology give us great instruments to do this kind of analysis, and this is what I want to talk to you about today. So the name of my project is Comparative Study of Planted Towns in 13th century Mecklenburg, a methodical approach. So I think I'm going to do a little introduction to the area and to the subject. If we look at today's shape of Germany, this is Germany today. If we look at the historical context of the planting process of these cities, we have to go back to the 10th or 12th century. This is in the year 1000 about. The river Elbe was very important in Germany because on one side of the river we had the Holy Roman Empire and Christianity as a main religion for people living there. While we're on the other side of the river, on the east side of the river, we had a lot of Wendish tribes or Slavic tribes, which had not taken up Christianity as their faith. So they were living in tribal society, early feudalist society with polytheistic religions. In addition to that, the Vikings dominated the northern part of Europe still at that time. And this is basically the setting where how the story of the Christianization and the settlement of these areas starts. We are talking about this area which I have marked red on the map here, which is today's part of Germany is called Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is basically a artificial result of Stalinist territorial geography, because Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is not a country, it is two countries which are very, very different, which have a very different history. And we have also here on the western side, we have the territory of Mecklenburg, which we are going to talk about more now in this lecture. And on the eastern side, part of the country is the part of Pommern, or what's left of Pommern. Pommern is has always been an independent dukedom, has never been a part or allied with Mecklenburg earlier in the history. Pommern has been a part of Prussia, and after World War II, when Poland got moved eastwards on the European map, 75% of Pommern became part of today's Poland. So that's so what we're seeing here is the rest of Pommern, and we are not talking about this area, Pommern, because it has a different history and different, and especially when we go back to the Middle Age, it's a totally different territory. So we're not going to talk about Pommern. We're going to talk about Mecklenburg. If we look at a map of Mecklenburg, this is basically the map of Mecklenburg, which basically stopped to exist as a part, as an independent part of Germany in 1918, when the last duke had to leave office. And Germany became a republic. These are the borders from 1918, and these are the borders that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture. In the time between the year 1000 and the year 1200, an early feudal states of the Wendish start to form in these areas. The interesting part is that there are these two basic tribes of the Wendish people, and these they lived in a tribal society, and they didn't know cities, which is especially interesting for our study here, because when German settlers entered this area in the 13th century and started to plant cities, we basically can see how cities were planted in the 13th century, because they didn't had to recognize already existing cities. They didn't have to take existing cities in consideration. They could just place the new settler cities wherever they thought it was right at that time. We're going to come back how they did that, and which basically gives us a situation where we have a tabula rasa. So we know there are very few structures from before the 13th century, and we can use these settler cities as a perfect example for how people were thinking of founding cities in the 13th century. We have to consider also the surrounding of these two Slavic tribes, which were still independent in the 12th century and up until the middle of the 12th century. But of course, the Christian dukedoms around, with Saxony in the west, Brandenburg, which was a former Slavic area, which basically got Christianized in the 11th and 12th century, in the south, and Pomerania and Poland in the east. And of course the Christian kingdom of Denmark in the north. All these Christian kingdoms, they were interested in this area, which at that time was very wet, not very good suited for settlement. Lots of forest, and the area which were not forested were basically wetlands. So this was not a very inviting area, sexy area that people were coming and all this. We have to go there. But it still between these big European powers, Saxony, Denmark, and Poland, and the Ascanians in the south, the Brandenburg area. This was kind of a blank, and that had to be filled. And the people who could fill this area first could lay their dominance on the northern, on the southern bank of the Baltic Sea. So this area was tried to be taken by the Saxons, which basically took over the Obergit dukedom. They did not slaughter all the Wends and bring in their own people, they, after some years of war, they kind of recognized that it was kind of smart to take over, to let the last Oberdreid Duke become Christian and let him become Duke of this area. So they kind of chose to coexist with the Slavic population in this area instead of wiping out these people. But they destroyed their cultural remains and the rest of their temples from their polytheistic religion and replaced them with churches. To fortify this area, they invited settlers, German-speaking settlers from Frisia, Angria, Westphalia and Saxony, while the eastern part of Mecklenburg was basically taken by the Ascanian Margraves and became a part of Brandenburg at that time. All the way up to the end of the 13th century, this part was Brandenburgish. So this is in a way the setting. So here we see, with the small points, we see all the cities that were founded in the 13th century for the settlers. We have to see the time between the year 900, 950 and the year 1350 as a time of great climatic changes in Europe. The medieval warm period made it possible to produce much more corn, much more fruits and vegetables, and much more children survived their childhood. So we are looking at a doubling of the population in Europe between the year 1000 and 1200. And all these people had to go somewhere, because if you're like three brothers who grow up on a farm, of course the oldest brother, he will inherit the farm, but the other two, what are they gonna do? And in the areas where people shared the inheritance of their father, the farms got smaller and smaller and smaller because they had to share them amongst the brothers who were there. So there was a real incentive to leave the areas where people were living in Westphalia and Frisia and get hired by locators and move east. To start a new existence in this new area that was taken from the Wendish people. And we can see a wave of city foundings beginning in the end of the 12th century. Here we have the first three cities. Schwerin, which is today the capital of the county of this part of Germany. We have the city of Gadebusch and Wittenberg. We can see that the planting of small villages is preceding the cities with about 10-15 years. So if we see all the small villages coming got planted in this area, we see also a west-east development. Then between the year 1200 and 1250, all these cities here were founded. And we can see that the space got filled with these cities who had an administrative function, who were serving as local markets for small regional markets. In addition to that, we have to look at two exceptions. The towns along the Baltic Sea, Wismar and Rostock, where German merchants already settled in the 12th century, and where the small merchant colonies already precede the planting of the cities and the German-speaking settlers. By the end of the 13th century, in the second half of the 13th century, the space in a way gets filled with another wave, with a third wave of city foundings. So when we look at this map here, by the end of the 13th century, we see about 40 new cities had been founded in that period of time. If we look a bit, we can see also not only new cities had been found. Some of these cities were double cities, because if you look, for example, at the upper part of the slide, Rostock has 3 years behind it: 1200, 1220, and 1250, because the city of Rostock is basically containing of 3 independent cities who got united in the middle of the 13th century, and each of the cities has their own planting date. If we look at this in a graphic way, here we have the number of planted towns in Mecklenburg spread on a graph starting in the 1160s and ending in the 14th century. And we see quite clearly, I have tried to mark this, the 13th century. We see the 13th century is the high age of city planting in this area. Very few cities got planted after the 13th century, and they look structurally very, very different, which I'm not going to talk about today. Interesting enough is the settlement of Mecklenburg just a part of a greater movement in this area. German settlers were settling all over the eastern part of Europe at that time. So I have taken out, in a way, the numbers for the different areas where we can see that Schleswig and Holstein, which is south of Denmark, which is shown yellow here, they start very early because they are very much in the west. We see Mecklenburg, which is gray, or also very early, while, for example, when we go to Preußen and Danzig and Schlesien, we see that this both the settlement period lasted longer, and got their high much later. So especially if we look at the area of Preußen, Prussia, and Danzig, the high time of settlement is in the 14th century, not in the 13th century. So it's very easy to see that there is a west-east development in this part, and we see how German cities spread eastwards, starting in the beginning of the 13th century eastwards. If we get back to Mecklenburg now, and I have just taken out some aerial shots of some of these cities. These cities have, of course, very great geometrical variances. They are very, very different. They are different in size, they have a different history, they have different planting reasons why they were planted. Some of these cities have to included also some Slavic villages that they included into their areas. So and it's of course, when you have 40 cities, they will be looking very, very different, so the interesting part is now to find a method. How can I analyze these 40 cities to give us some meaningful results? Because they vary from like 50,000 square meters, the smallest maybe, the island here, which we see in the center, Malchow, which is a very small island. This is just 50,000 square meters in area, and the largest of these is 750,000. So it's about 15 times bigger than the smallest one. So it's very difficult to have a meaningful measuring method, and that is what I'm trying to do with my work. So, when we now try to define what we're trying to find out, I asked myself some questions. For example, it's 100 years is not a very long time. Were there generic geometrical layouts? Was there kind of a city shape ideal at that time that people tried to follow when they planted their cities, or was it completely random? What influence have political and locational circumstances? Is the city on an island? Is the city in a landscape? Is it on a ridge? Is it on the top of the hill? Is it in the valley by a river? What kind of influences do we have from that? And what kind of political influences? What kind of duke started? Some of these dukes at that time, they are called the city founders. So is that true? Is that something that we can document? Or is it basically just all random? Did the trends change over time? I mean, still, even though historically seen 100 years is not a very long time, still it could be interesting to see if the cities founded further west from the beginning of the 13th century, if they look different from the cities further east, founded by the end of the 13th century. So, and what parts of the existing structures that we found today can be still traced back to the 13th century? And of course, how can this knowledge be used for example, open possibilities for economic growth, tourism, making people more aware of their history? All these different questions I asked myself, but at the same time I had to find out, how can I harvest knowledge and information from all the informations that were available. So I'm going to talk about that now. Well, traditionally, we have two different ways of harvesting information from historical processes. And these two different methods, these two different ways, this is of course written sources on the one hand, and urban archaeology, which gives us a very powerful and direct path to historical events. If we look at these two methods, and apply this to the area that we're looking at. So we can see that in Mecklenburg we have a very powerful publication from 1886, which is called the Mecklenburgisches Urkundenbuch, which is basically a collection of historical documents from the Middle Age all the way back to the 12th century. These documents were collected by historians from all types of archives, both in the Vatican, in different archives all around Germany, and of course the available documents in Mecklenburg. So these documents are very valuable, but they have to be taken with great caution, because as we have found out that there is a lot of written documents from the Middle Age that are actually falsified. Because writing and reading was such a scarce resource at that time, it was very easy to claim ownership of a plot of land or certain privileges by falsifying a document saying that you're actually the owner of this, or your father or your grandfather was the owner of this certain plot. So we have found out that a great number of documents are actually falsified, and we have to take written sources with great caution. In addition to that, the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century was a great age for history writing. Based on these documents, people started writing books about how the history of Mecklenburg actually took place. And we have to see now that these documents are basically very much focused on which king started taking over reign in what year, which battles he fought, which areas he put under his reign. So it's very much oriented to document, to write history from basically from the perspective of the ruling class at that time. And at the same time, the beginning of the 20th century was also a time, or especially also the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century was a time where historical knowledge was used to justify claims to a national history, because this was the age of the national states, of the powerful national states in Europe. And for example, in Mecklenburg, we can see that the history of the German settlement in Mecklenburg is always depicted as the start of the history, because the slaves, they were basically helpless and couldn't help themselves. And first the German settlers, they could kind of, first when they came, the development could start. So in a way, the history writing from that time is full of myths, political and historical hatchet jobs. The second method is archaeology. And of course, archaeology is a fantastic tool to approach information from ancient times. You dig and you find, let's say you find a spoon, you can actually with a great certainty document that this spoon has been here. You can date this spoon. You can say, well, this spoon, is a real artifact from that time, and you can connect it to the reality of this place at a certain time. That's of course very, very powerful, and which tells us also much more about the real living conditions of people. Not only how the ruling class writes about these times. The problem with the archaeology is that digging is expensive, and you cannot tear down buildings just to start digging and try to find out about the history of a place. Our archaeological surveys are basically bound to areas where, for example, a house is being built and an archaeological survey in the ground below the house is done, and we can find exactly what has been going on under this house at a certain time and age. That is not very helpful if you want to write a history of an entire town. You cannot tear down an entire town just to dig out the history of that place, because you're also destroying the subject of your investigation by investigating. So that's why we have developed less intrusive methods of archaeology. For example, the magnetic survey is a very cost-saving method. It's not so invasive. You don't have to dig down. You can see this at this picture here. Somebody is driving with this measuring instrument over a meadow, and by mapping changes in magnetic field, you can actually find large rocks or formations that are hidden under the ground. Here you can see at this black and white picture, you can see from this survey that Messal and Rassmann did in Altkaln, which is one of our 40 cities, how they found this Slavic castle under a meadow. So it's very, very easy to see at this map of the magnetic survey. So the thing is, how can we, which place does urban morphology have in this? I think this work will also contribute to establish urban morphology, basically as a third way to access historical information. Because if we look at this plan here, which is from Tetero, also one of these towns, we see that the way the streets are laid out, we have all the elements of a medieval city. We have the church, the town hall, the market square. We have two gates, two existing town gates still existing, and we can see how the layout of the city has been since the Middle Age. So we can also see existing buildings and the plot structure that is from 2019 in this. And we can deduct information from these plans to add to the other informations that we have from written sources and from archaeology. So how can I harvest all this information and bring it into a system? And how can I compare the different results from the different cities? I have these 3 methods now that I have put in here. It's the written documents. First, in the middle is archaeology, and urban morphology as a third method of approaching historical information, and bringing these 3 together to map findings from the cities, because the findings will naturally enough be all over the place. Sometimes I have a written document that's saying in 1293 something happened. At the same time, somebody will dig out something that is maybe dated at the same time, but it has no direct connection to the written information that I got. And at the same time, I have this the results from my urban morphology approach, which are basically geometrical and statistical, and I have these results are very, very different in their nature, and to bring all this information together in a system is actually a very big challenge. So that's why I wanted to try a method that is comparative. Having a comparative approach. That means I'm collecting informations, all the archaeological informations from one city and the second, and from all the cities, and then I can compare results from these cities by having them collected in a certain method. I wanted to draw from all available sources, not only the written and not only the archaeological, but also from the urban morphology. I wanted to draw from all available sources, and I wanted to put them in a system. And I wanted to approach this with an open result, meaning that I was not really sure. I didn't want to go in with a thesis and saying, well, the development of cities in the 13th century went this and this and this and that way, and then I'm using my work to prove or disprove my thesis. I wanted to choose an open an open approach. I didn't have a thesis. I wanted the thesis to evolve while I am working. So, because I thought that would make me more open to different type of results. But how is it possible to collect all this different informations? And fortunately, I found a book that gave me a kind of a methodical clue about how this could be done. I found this book from Erich Kaiser, Das Deutsche Städtebuch, published in 1939 in Stuttgart. And this book is basically structured like in a matrix fashion. That you kind of say, well, I am having a certain structure. Let's say under the letter A, I'm going to collect all this type of information. Under the letter B, I'm collecting all, let's say, all city fires. On the letter C, I'm going to collect all the information concerning about public buildings in this city. Erich Kaiser, he was a historian, so his approach was very based on written sources. I wanted to widen up this approach into a method where I could collect data from all these different sources and put them into a matrix. But I used the matrix structure from Kaiser's book, extended it, and created a one that is kind of more fitting to my approach. So I decided that I wanted to create 2 different elements to my work. It's the catalog, the city catalog, where I kind of just list all the different information that I could find about these cities. And then when I'm done having collected all this information, I want to write a summary, because while I'm doing this cataloging, I will kind of get a picture of, I think lines will appear, interesting causal lines or interesting observations that I can write down while I'm doing this, and to make it able to write a summary where I kind of which is basically introduction to this catalog, where I can systematize, generalize, and try to draw some more general lines how the development in all these 40 cities is done. So how is the structure looking like? I separate this after the Kaiser method into different types of information under the chapter A, and this chapters I'm going to apply to each and every city. Under chapter A, I'm working more generally about the city, the state of knowledge. I'm going to find all the written sources that I can find from the Middle Age that are relevant for the city's shape and form and development. I am finding what's available of informations about the planting process, the populations, city governments, courts, and stuff like that. In the chapter B, I'm going to look more as to see the city in the relation to the landscape, not only with the landscape, but also in the region, in their structure, in the political structure. What functions does this city have? How are they placed in the topography? Are they on a hill? Are they in a valley, by a river, on an island? All these different types of things. And there's some economical, because all these different topological information will give us clues about economy. For example, if a city is placed alongside a river, there will be possibilities for building mills, which can be a base for an urban economy in a city like this. In the chapter C, I'm going to look at morphological analysis, and here I'm going to work basically in a statistical and a geometrical approach. I'm going to look at city shape, street system, slope, width and length, block structure, and plots. Here I'm basically applying Constant's categories of how to split up different layers and hierarchies of morphological analysis. And in chapter D and E, I want to look at certain type of buildings. For example, I'm starting in chapter D with the periphery of the city, city walls and city gates, because they will give us also a clue connected to the situation of the city and the landscape, situation inside the feudal politics. And look at the market. In chapter E, we're looking at the market, the town hall, placement of the town hall, where is it, if there was a castle or not, where it is, which function it had, churches, monasteries, all built structure that we can trace back to the 13th century, we're trying to bring in here. And of course, we finish with a good literature chapter for each and every city. When I'm done with all this, then I'm applying this structure A to F, applying the same structure to the summary, and then I'm going to write summatory articles about all the 40 cities with the same structure as I have applied to each and every city. Well, in the third and last part of this lecture, I want to show you how I went about this. By taking one of these 40 cities and just showing you what kind of analysis I did and what kind of challenges I met. So I chose the city of Malchin, which is central in the area of Mecklenburg, and I just want to show you what kind of work and what kind of results you could expect from this comparative approach. Okay, let's just recap very fast. This is the matrix, my matrix that I want to put all the relevant informations in. The matrix is based on Kaiser's encyclopedic way of sorting information. And when we get to the morphological analysis, I'm going to use definitions made by Constant and Kropf. Yes, let's just see how this works out. the little town of Malchin is, as I said, is both on the periphery and on the center of Mecklenburg. Population about 7,500 today. And in the center of the city we have a medieval town center. We see this on the left-hand picture here. What we also can see that the city has been heavily damaged, like lots of other cities in this area. We can see on the aerial pictures made in 1953, the pink area is the only area not affected by a tremendous fire that destroyed the city night to 1st of May 1945, when the Russian troops entered the area. That also makes it a little bit complicated to find all the structures. As you can see in the aerial shot here, there's a lot of building blocks in industrial, produced in industrial construction methods, long blocks in the modern tradition, and just only some fill-ins in some on some sites that are close to the market. So let's see what this does to our matrix. Let's look at first at the A, short introduction in history. This is basically an analysis of the existing texts and literature. Here we have taken out some examples, text examples from this analysis. On written sources, I went into this Mecklenburgisches Urkundenbuch, which collects all the old documents from the Middle Age, and took out everything that I thought was relevant to the city's development and to the people where people are mentioned that are related to the city. Among those documents, we see MUB 449 from April 7th, 1236, where Nicholas of Werle, the Duke, donates the city with the town privileges of the city of Schwerin, which is basically the founding document of the city. We have on the A2 the settlement prior to the 13th century. We have very little traces here. We have a dendrochronological analysis of all findings in this area by Westphal in 2002, which turns out confirms all the dating of the start of the cities, because here we can see that that there were heavy settlement activities during the time 1220 plus minus 10 years. So that confirms also the date of 1236, where the city privileges were given by the Duke. We can see that maybe some of the building activities have preceded this, the donation of the city, but in a way we can be quite confident that the written sources about the age of the city are pretty accurate. So we just jump over lots of other informations here. We jump to category B, which is the city in the landscape and the position in the region. Here, for example, I took the liberty to draw up some of the planted cities from the 13th century and line them up with known trade routes. And we can see that between those cities there were always about 30 to 40 kilometers distance, so which was basically a daily travel route for a merchant that had to travel from city to city. So here we can see that the placement of the cities is not accidental, but it's in a way fits into a system where the cities were placed in certain distances make trade routes possible. We see also Malchin has a very central place in the trade routes between the western and the eastern part of the duchies of Mecklenburg and further on to the Margraviate of Brandenburg and the Duchy of Pomerania. If we look a little closer into the topography situation, we see that in category B3 topography, we have basically taken out a part of the map of this area, and we can see that the city sits on the northern end of a ridge. Here I marked it in red. And this ridge basically frames these wetlands that are between two big lakes, the Lake Malchin and Lake Malchin and Lake Kumro. And Malchin is in a way a bridgehead for the Mecklenburg duchies, who acquired this area in the 1220s from the Dukes of Pomerania, and the Malchin is in a way a bridgehead on the eastern shore of these wetlands, who made it possible to build an infrastructure in these newly acquired lands for the Dukes of Mecklenburg. We see also the trade routes going out of the city, going to Kahlen and continuing to Rostock and Schwerin. And we also see on the south side, we see this connected to the city of Waren, which is a bit younger than Malchin. New Brandenburg, which is also a bit younger than Malchin, and Güstrow, which is about the same age. If we look at the next category, the morphological analysis, which is basically done with the methods of geometry and statistics, we can see at city shape here is basically a mapping everything we know about the city, the shape of the medieval city. We have some city walls that are left, shown here on the right-hand side of the city. The others are stippled in because we are not really sure where the walls have been. So we suspect this geometry of the city. We see also that the parochial church, St. John, sits on one of the highest points of the city. Only the castle sits higher. We remember the ridge coming. There's a ridge coming from the southwest, and the castle sits on the highest point of the city. St. John is a little bit below. The market is about the same height as the church, and the rest of the city is falling towards the wetlands and the river, which does not go through the city, but passes the city on the side. If we look at this next slide that shows the street system, here we took some measurements of the angles of the street system. And we see that there is a surprising, if we take the center lines of the existing streets from 2019, there is a very surprising accuracy when we look at which angles these streets are placed, and we can also see that the market, that the east-west street, that those are a bit drawn together towards the market, so that the block where the market is placed is smaller than the other blocks that are in the same line. So that's kind of an interesting observation that we can take with us further when we talk about the market. When we looked at the street systems, we were also interested in the street width. The street width is, of course, not so very interesting related to Middle Age, because the street width is basically has changed a lot of times since the Middle Age. More interesting is slope and drainage. Because of course the surface water had to find its way out of the city, or also in the Middle Ages. We kind of measured up the existing heights and all the crossing points of the streets, and decided which way the water had to go to leave to get out of the city. And we see also that some of the slopes are very steep, that are the red ones, and some of them are very very flat. Some areas are very flat, which is green and gray. If we look at the block structure, we see two types of blocks. In the center of the city, we see rectangular blocks, while the outer blocks that are adjusted to the geometry of the city walls, so they have only partly rectangular geometry. And our analysis of the city blocks are basically split it into looking at average plot size. So we just counted the number of plots in each block, took the block area and created by that a map of the average plot size inside the city. So which shows also that some of the plots are very small in the northwestern corner, which we suspect are garden plots, which were not plots that were built on, and larger plots around the market. While some of the areas are very difficult to measure. As we can see, some of the plots are gray, and that means basically that the plot structure, the medieval plot structure, is destroyed in this area and cannot be reconstructed. If we look further to the plots, here is still some analysis remaining. We have only analyzed the plot width, which we think is very relevant for how large the plots were. The good thing about this, the area being overbuilt by industrial structures, is that in the communist East German time, you could build these big structures without having to seize the property. That means the underlying plot structure is not changed since 1945. That we can be sure of. Even though there are some industrial blocks, 4-floor concrete blocks on top of them, but the plot structure is intact. And here we measured the width of the plots, and we translated the width of the plots into Mecklenburg foot, which is basically 28.8 centimeter long. And afterwards we correlated the number of plots with a certain the number of plots which had a certain width, and we try to make some correlations here. You can see that the red ones, they are. I thought it was interesting that we had a spike at 33 and a spike at 66, and another spike in the middle at 48, and so we think that maybe the plots with this width were more common and maybe represented a full house instead of half a house or other types of plots. This, of course, is not very meaningful, just being done in one city. We looked here at about 120 plots that we put in here. But if we get data from more cities, this will be much more interesting and much more statistically relevant to look at. That is fortifications. Here we also can see that we had some old maps we could go back to. This is a map from 1720 that we could look back and see how the city was looking at that time. So we can reconstruct part of the city walls which were basically still intact at that time. At least at the drawing we can see where some of the ramparts and some of the towers and wall houses are. So we were able to reconstruct some of the features of the medieval walls. So we know that where the gates are, you can see the 4 gates. 3 of the gates were double gate structures, while the Mühlentor, which was actually a 3-gate business. So you had to go through 3 gates to get out of the city. We can see that there's always an inner gate. These inner gates were the first to be torn down in the 19th century. and there's always a more decorative outer gate. And we're lucky that 2 of these outer gates have survived also the 20th century and the destruction of the city. And we thought it was interesting, especially to look at the Vargentina Tor, because we were able to find 3 historical pictures of the Vargentina Tor. Here you can see all the different photos that we could find of these gates. The Steintor and Karlensches Tor, the 2 top, they are still existing and can be easily measured up, while the Vargentina Tor, the 3rd one, we have only photos, and it's impossible to reconstruct an old gate just from photos. But if you have the footprint and if you have the plot plan, then it is actually possible to do reconstruction work just by using these photos and the plan drawings. The Mühlentor, we unfortunately couldn't find any old materials to reconstruct anything. So we draw up first. This is the Karlensches Tor, which is one of the existing gates where we kind of studied the architecture and which is a Gothic brick architecture made in the 15th century. And from that on, it was easier to reconstruct also the Vargentina Tor, where we basically used the site plan that you see on the bottom here, and these old photos to be able to reconstruct how this gate was looking before it got torn down in 1868 and 1872. From there, we go to the placement of the urban functions inside the city shape. Let's start with the market. Here it is interesting to see the relation between the town hall, the market, and the parochial church, which in Malchin is very close. They are very close to each other, as you can see in this aerial photo from the 1930s, which shows also how the city looked like before it burned down in 1945. Interesting also to see at this old map from the 1720s and see how the town hall has developed here. So we could do some sketches on how the market has been developing and how the placement of the town hall has been changed over time. So interesting questions remain. For example, it could be very interesting if you look at 40 cities altogether. Is, for example, if you relate the size of the market in a city, if you relate that to the geometrical size of a city, because in some cities the market will be bigger related to the geometrical size of the city than in other cities. Can that be related to the importance for regional trade at that time? I don't know the answer to that question. We will see where our statistical analysis will lead us. Interesting also to look at the remaining buildings from that time. So here we can see also St. Mary's Chapel and St. John's Church, where we could find some literature about the timing of these parts. We can see also that the St. Mary's Chapel is built in the 15th, end of 14th, beginning of the 15th century. That was a time where we had a lot of host desecration cases in Mecklenburg, where basically the Jewish community was blamed for bad climate, bad weather that churned in the middle of the 14th century in Europe, and they were trying to be blamed for host desecrations, and there were purges and massacres happening at that time. And at that time, a number of these St. Mary's Chapel appeared in some of the towns of Mecklenburg to recognize these events. Here in Malchin, we can see that the St. Mary's Chapel is built in direct connection with the existing parochial church. So we thought that that gives also the church a very imposing figure if you're walking around in the city, which can be explained through the history of this place. We were also looking at other institutions, monastic institutions. There was a monastic yard from a nearby monastery in the city. There is very little known about the castle. In category E3 is the castle, where it's basically only known that the citizens of Malchin took matters into their own hands and destroyed the castle in the beginning of the 14th century. Here we found some old pictures from the time before the fire. This is the old Holy Spirit Chapel, one of the second church inside the city. There are supposed to have been 4 different chapels. This was the only one remaining until 1945. It was torn down after the fire and is not anymore, but you can see there is a Gothic entrance porticus on the long side of this chapel. And interestingly enough, the shape of the chapel can still be seen in the plot plan from 2019, even though there is a drugstore now on the place where the chapel has been. Well, to sum up, I think we could, of course, go into all the different categories here, but we're out of time. So I think I wanted to establish urban morphology as a third road into knowledge about the city. I have been trying to establish a method how I can collect data of very different natures, some geometrical, some statistical, some historical, into a system where it can be read and compared with each other from different cities. We will see if this method will hold for the next cities, but for Malchin we can already now see that our knowledge about the city has been growing, and we could connect a lot of the loose ends that written and archaeological evidence left us by using the site plans and the plot plans to reconstruct some of the features of the medieval city. So thank you for listening to this little lecture. I'm sorry that I went a little bit over time, but I hope it was anyway interesting for you. I want to follow up this lecture by an article where I kind of formulate more of the methodical strategy that I'm working on here. So, but I hope it was a nice introduction into this into the subject. I hope we can be together at the next occasion and we can meet actually in person. So, thank you for listening.